Hey, hello.
Hello, hello.
Hey,
How are you doing?
I'm doing good. Uh, just chilling on school night. How you doing?
I am doing okay. I'm live streaming, because it's my job to do so. Give us whatever name you'd like to be called, your pronouns, and then let's get to it.
All right. Oh, you can call me Nickolas. And he, him are my pronouns. And yeah.
So, what do you have on your mind, Nicholas?
All right. So, I'm gonna start off with like a small anecdote, if that's okay. I don't
Yeah,
wanna. It won't be too long. Okay. Um, so I go to a university in Texas here. I'm from Dallas, and I remember one of the weirdest things that happened to me is when I went to university. My mom's crying at my graduation and stuff. I learn, I'm in criminal justice and I'm learning about how fucked up the criminal justice system is. I come back, I try to explain like how fucked we've been by it. And he just, it doesn't really connect with her. Uh, One time my mom was telling me about a time that she went out to dinner with a friend and the friend's daughter was there with her boyfriend. And the friend's daughter started kind of talking about, you know, systemic racism. Friend's daughter is white, by the way, so starts talking to the my mom about systemic racism and how the black community has been fucked, and she ran into the same problem that I did. There's a little bit of a disconnect there, and not one that you would expect going into a space where you kind of expect like this stuff to be like common knowledge or accepted. Um, so remember when you were talking with Professor Flowers, you said something about you guys kind of had a little disagreement about like staying in your lane. Uh, and I kind of wanted to bring that back up because something that this white daughter kind of did accidentally with my mom is she kind of stepped out of her lane and tried to kind of make it seem like she knew more about the black experience than my mom did. And from a statistical and analytical viewpoint, I wouldn't doubt that. My mom just is kind of like uninformed about the shit. But at the same time, there's also like the personalized experience of being black, which you cannot kind of just take the statistics and then play over, because then you run the risk of offending people. And that's kind of what I wanted to talk to you about, is kind of like courtesy and how do we kind of navigate these lanes and accept that they exist in a way that's like realistic. Because I know that you kind of pruning your fan base. I don't know if that's the right word. You're kind of like getting your fan base ready to go out and canvas and organize and get them involved in like all types of cool shit like mutual aid. But when it involves going into marginalized communities, they have to realize that there's a way to talk to people about information that they're a little bit, opposed to, about insulting them and possibly disenfranchising them further. So, do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, I certainly hope that if we're doing any canvassing, nobody in my audience would insult the people that we're trying to curry the vote from. Uh,
Yes.
yeah, I that would be, I think, a bad strategy on a number of levels. What do you think specifically the issue is here? Do you or so prescriptively, I guess, like in terms of my community or my behavior? What issues do you take with what's been done?
Well, like I said, I was watching the Professor Flowers debate, and first of all, regardless of what any of these people say, I fully accept that you're not an anti-Semite or a pedophile or any of that type of shit. I think that shit is wild. But one thing that she did kind of hit on that I kind of resonated with is that yes, uh, and this kind of goes back to the NoName tweet as well. Um, there's kind of an issue where we have, because I organize a lot, and there's kind of an issue where we have like white, not even like leftists all the time, but like white liberals. They'll come into these ghettos, and they're here to do their missionary achievement, and they kind of pretend to know more about black issues than black people do because the black people there might not have access to the statistics and might not have access to all the information, so they kind of overstep that boundary by asserting that they know more in a kind of paternalistic fashion. You understand what I'm saying?
Hmm.
So it's kind of like that. And I noticed that, like, when I was watching the Professor Flowers chat, I saw in chat that, like, a lot of people were kind of like opposed to this idea that that happens. Kind of just kind of like downplaying it or being like, "What the fuck are you talking about?" Or all this does is make white people more anxious about participating, you know what I'm saying, in organizing in marginalized communities and stuff like that. And I can't agree with that. You know what I'm saying? Just like actually like going out and organizing and seeing this stuff like as it happens. I have like too many anecdotes about like just how sometimes not even necessarily just white people, but white people who aren't from or people who aren't from a certain area going into another area, not knowing enough about the culture and not asking enough questions uh, to really have a foothold in moving people left to do what they need to do to have their own autonomy and stuff. So it's kind of like something that I noticed.
I'll acknowledge that there's a pretty big difference between being educated on an issue and being able to speak on that issue with people of a different sociopolitical background without making a fool of yourself or invalidating their experiences. It's definitely a skill. I guess the issue that I have is that it seems like there's been an overreaction to an initial existing problem, which has ended up creating a separate secondary problem, and we've gotten no closer to the real solution. The initial problem are like well-meaning liberals with a sort of paternalistic attitude towards race issues, usually white, who will speak with or about black issues, and they'll do so in a way which projects a kind of authoritative intent that can come off as misguided at best and oftentimes quite alienating for people who are actually black or people familiar with the issues. The issue is that I feel the counter argument to that sometimes has been too severe. The idea that white should stay in their lane, that white people should focus on white people problems, etc. You should always listen to marginalized people and not speak when they're speaking. And the problem we have there is that we've created kind of the opposite issue, where you have a bunch of people who are too checked out to even comment on these problems. Like if they're white, they feel it's not their right to, which I don't find an acceptable outcome. And sometimes they do even more damage downstream by paternalistically gatekeeping access to these topics for other people, regardless of whether they're white. So online right now, for example, there are a ton of people who are not Jews calling my Jewish followers anti-Semites for recognizing the fact that historical discrimination did put Jews in disproportionate places in certain elements of Germany's financial sector. There are non-black people on Twitter calling black followers of mine racist for saying that it's not okay to commit an ethnic cleansing against people who share a race with your colonizers 300 years ago. So I feel like the overcorrection here has led to its own set of problems. So my solution to this is ignore the race entirely with regards to who can participate, but acknowledge it as a factor in your pre-existing biases. Anyone should be able to speak on any issue, but you have to take into consideration the fact that if you're white and you have had very different experiences than people of some groups, that you should be, more careful or more reflective before engaging with this stuff. And for what it's worth, I think my audience does that, because with Professor Flower's stuff, she was out of her lane. She was talking about indigenous issues. She's not indigenous, right? So in terms of that discussion, I feel like we both have equal credence to just bowl over each other rhetorically. But the times that we've had people on who talk about more lived experience type stuff, we've done that with indigenous people, black people, whatever. Usually when that happens, there's a greater degree of deference offered, because even though I don't think lived experience is everything, it is something, and it's something that I don't have with regards to many of their experiences. So that's the approach that I take. If it comes off as chauvinistic, I feel like that's because often I'm arguing against the people who are promoting the bad version of the idea than it is because I'm arguing against the idea that lived experiences should be taken into account at all.
And that's another thing I was about to say. Like, yeah, sometimes it does kind of like because I understand, it can be very frustrating, maybe arguing with somebody who has the views of somebody like Professor Flowers, and then sometimes for the lols, you know what I'm saying? It's kind of like it ends up becoming an issue of uh, sometimes like you miss like key details of like what it kind of described, which you acknowledge is a real issue. You know what I'm saying? The paternalism and kind of the indifference to these racial boundaries and lines, but it kind of comes down to like, are we kind of able to say, okay, person made a valid point in the midst of that without kind of like overstepping it. But going back, and sort of talking about what it's like to, not gatekeeping people based on their race to organize. I don't believe that that's a thing that people should do at all. But what I will say, in regards to NoName's tweet, and I don't really know the surrounding tweets or the context of that tweet in particular. I'm not on social media like that, but uh, I did kind of agree with the sentiment that we should have sort of not necessarily like there's a concern of white people in black marginalized communities over like the trailer park, you know,
How
because those
so?
places really do exist. So like say I rarely see like organizations, at least in Dallas. It might be different in other places, but in Dallas specifically, usually the white poor spaces in Dallas get completely and utterly ignored, and all of the white people who are leftist come to the black neighborhoods to do their organizing. And when they come, usually they don't really come with a good type of concern. Like it's very sloppy shit. But like I remember one time I was working on a community garden, and we're shoveling compost. It's my first time kind of like leading people into doing this process, and I was there, and usually all the people who live in that neighborhood, they're on board. They're doing this because they realize that we live in a food desert and not people have, and people have to drive 40 minutes to get good produce. So like it's important to us, but the people who come from outside of the neighborhood, inside of the neighborhood, and they're sitting over there talking, not really participating, not really being engaged, and not taking it seriously. You know? And maybe it's because it's not like a pressing issue to them. Like maybe it's kind of like, oh, well, we showed up and then that's fine. But what about, what I'm saying? Like maybe they would feel more connected to the issue if it was in their own neighborhood or with people who understand what it's like to be white in America, which I imagine is also kind of a torturous experience for the same reasons it's torturous to be a black person in America. Do you understand like what I'm getting at with that?
Yeah, of course. The issue is I don't know if there's a way to correct for that perfectly. Because I feel like
Mm.
at the end of the day, and I'm saying this as a white person who grew up in a very nice neighborhood, um, the way like poverty and blackness are experienced by a lot of people who then go on to be like white leftists is in alternates between like criminalized and degraded and highly fetishized and like pity farmed, basically. That there's
Yes, yes.
this whiplash between like conservative media that will, treat it like the source of all problems in America, and then like usually sympathetic liberal media that'll, uh, of course there's nothing wrong with being sympathetic, but it turns into
Mm.
like this, paternalistic, oh, you can help, 5 cents gives one Detroit kid an extra PB&J sandwich before school, so on. um and that can definitely fuck with a lot of people's perspectives. I don't deny that. It's just the way No Name went about that. Like, man, if you're gonna be talking about like No Name's done some weird stuff before, the whole like not doing concerts because white people were showing up, even though
Yeah,
the people showing up were the ones who paid for the concert, so they were definitely fans for music, you know. um
sure.
like that's pretty weird. And then like I guess when you're talking about something as complicated as essentially white people check your privilege before you help black people out with black issues, like there are so
Mm.
many ways to phrase that and so many ways to go about that, and the worst way to go about that is like, whitey, stay in your lane. And I feel like that's the road she chose, and I feel like that's probably because No Name is more motivated by personal spite against white people, or a kind of maybe not spite, disillusionment, than by like a very affirmative, like social justice perspective. Which why wouldn't she be,
I
right?
don't.
Like she's
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
she's a celebrity. She's not like a professor of social justice or whatever. Like we wouldn't expect her language to be perfectly accommodating of social good, but there were definitely issues with that, right?
Yeah, like I think that it's kind of I promise I'm not having a Joker moment. Okay,
Hmm.
basically, I think that it reminds me of my sister a lot. My sister is she's a black woman, and there's a fire there for sure. But I think that probably just comes with just like the frustration, how difficult that is. Something I didn't understand for a long time. I used to be very annoyed by it, about like kind of how vitriolic or snappy she could be in regards to like race issues or like talking about white people and stuff like that. But I understand it more now as like kind of like a venting or a coping mechanism. It
Oh,
sometimes feels
I'm fine.
powerful to say, you know what I'm saying, like white people stay in your lane when your whole lived experience as a black woman in this nation is like shitty as hell. Especially NoName, somebody who was born in like Southside Chicago. It's like
No, I
it's
get that, but there's a pretty
yeah.
big difference between doing that interpersonally with friends and tweeting that as like a celebrity, right? I mean, like
Yeah.
I don't think there's anything inherently misogynistic about like complaining about women after going on a bad date, but I definitely would take issue with like a major celebrity complaining about women as a concept on Twitter, right? I mean, there's a pretty big
Yeah.
difference in context in terms of like the audience, how it might be received, and
It's
people
not the
don't just
same as
take it
like
as venting
it.
either.
Yeah, it's not the same as though like if let's say if I know I hate doing this, but like if a white person did that in reverse, like it's not me like justifiable
No,
in
no, it's
reverse.
it's definitely not as socially harmful. I think that in
Yeah.
terms of like where in our brains it comes from, it's basically the same, just less severe and less socially harmful. Because when I was younger, especially in college, I was under the impression that like the bad, harmful, systemic racism came from this like unique part of the brain, that it was about hate and it was irrational. But then like
Mm.
the kind of casual, like less harmful anti-white tendencies, prejudices some black people have came from a different part, and that it was fine, and that it was, the gasp of the oppressed and so on. But experiences taught me it's basically the same, that people who, when frustrated or down on their luck, will like blame white people if they're black in an irrational way, like not blame white supremacy, but blame white people. That's
Mm.
it comes from the same place in the brain. The only difference really is how socially harmful it is, right? Because that's
Yeah.
what people who are racist against black people think. They think like, well, I'm down on my shit because like black people are doing X or Y. Like they're not
Right.
thinking in their head like, oh, this is extra irrational. This is extra hateful. It comes from the same impetus, I think.
This is what I will say. This is what I will say. Okay, like as far as like it's not individual white people. And I'm not saying that like white people as individuals are pushing racism forward, but I don't know how to describe it without like sound. I don't want to get eaten up by chat or anything, but white people kind of are a little annoying on a day to day when you're like kind of forced into spaces
Oh,
and you
we're
get like
oh
all these like
we're
you're
terrible.
just yeah, like you're bombarded by microaggressions.
But hey,
Like
can I be
like
100% real with you?
okay.
Walk through a really poor inner city neighborhood and spend 10 years doing that, and some people are going to get some real bad impressions of black people too, because poverty and
Mm,
desperation bears
hey,
bad
hold on.
personalities of a lot of
Yeah,
folks.
yeah. No. But I'm not even talking about just like poor white people. Like, yeah, poor white people are racist or whatever. But I live in Texas, right?
Hmm.
Texas has a different and special type of racism. If you go to Alabama, they'll just straight up call you. I don't know if I can say it on the stream, but they'll just like straight up be mean racist to you.
Yeah.
Texas, you have to deal with the nice racist. No, I wouldn't
Right,
say
the
so far as
paternalistic,
colorblind.
yeah.
Yeah, like those type of people.
The
But like
only
for
point I'm
example,
getting at is that it's not
yeah,
essentialist. Socioeconomic
yeah, it's
forces
not. No.
conspire. Right.
Not essentialist.
Well, that's always my issue. When you take, there's a huge difference between taking issue with like the socioeconomic forces that bring about certain groups of people to act certain ways and being
Oh,
essentialist about it. The issue is that often they get conflated, and ambiguous language trends towards essentialization. So, for example, right now, and to bear out the clips myself, I will cite not but Key and Peele, Dave Chappelle, and the Boondocks writers, who will all happily agree
oh,
that there are problems with black culture in America, and anyone who denies this
sure.
is delusional. Now, as to what those problems are, I leave it entirely to their catalog of work. But if you're to complain about those things, as many a white conservative do, it's kind of racist because the implication is often an essentialist one. It's not like, I hate it when black people do X or Y, and that's why I want to fight against the socioeconomic forces that lead to income inequality, which is the reason why this tends to happen. It's always, I hate it when black people do X and Y, beat end. And the implication people will draw from that is always black people are bad. And the only issue I have with complaining about white people, and again, we're talking about a much lower level of social harm, much lower, almost incomparably lower. But I think essentialism is bad here too sometimes, because if your issues with white people are like white people are chauvinist, elitist, and patronizingly paternalistic when they deal with racial issues because of a history of white supremacy that they internalize, go for it. That's totally true. But there
Oh.
are people who will say, white people are like this, and it's kind of open, right? And I think that can be kind of
Well,
bad.
let me explain that. Let me explain that. Like, so, like, it's kind of like this is another thing. Is stay in your lane. Or hold on, I wrote it down in my notes for this specifically because it's something that. Okay, this is. Oh, that's right. This isn't for you. Yeah, sorry about that. This isn't for you. Okay, so online we share a space with everybody, but sometimes when black people are trying to give a message to black people, because it's a predominantly white space, that we can't X white people out of. White people feel a need to kind of give their input on certain things. So I noticed this really early on one time where before I was even like a leftist, like before even a Bernie crat, I remember I got really annoyed online one time because somebody was trying to discuss black entertainment television, right? And they're trying to discuss black entertainment television and stuff like that, or trying to or another example is they're trying to discuss like, oh, rap as a black music form, and white people will kind of like flood the comment sections and be like, how is rap a black music form, or how is this a issue, or like let's say somebody says black girls are beautiful, black girls have beautiful hair, you know what I'm saying, or whatever, then of course you have your all girls have beautiful hair, why do you have to make it about race? So like I feel like that sometimes when people are trying to speak generally, they're kind of like speaking to people that kind of they suppose share their experience, who kind of have a common understanding of the social context behind it. But I don't think that a white supremacist or a conservative who complains about black culture is doing the same thing, because they are making it essentialist. Their common understanding with other people is that yes, this is an essential characteristic of black people, and that's what they're all getting in on. But when a black person says like, man, white people are annoying, I think that they're I mean, you can make the argument that they need to be more clear about it, but I think that when black people say like white people are annoying, they're kind of understanding that like obviously it's not an essential thing, but it is a cultural thing. Like
Is it? Because, again,
yeah,
I say white people are annoying, but I don't think that, like, prejudiced thinking is actually that much more common across racial groups. I just think that social harm and the types tend to vary. Because if you look at, for example, whether or not you support interracial marriage, there are a lot of old black people who don't want their kids marrying white folks, right? And that's pretty weird.
like my
Um,
mom.
which is pretty weird, because you
Yeah,
can
but I
talk
can
about like
yeah.
preserving culture all you want, but not wanting miscegenation is like one of the
It's
most
it's actually
racist
more of an
things.
economical thing. When my mom, I remember my mom gave me this. I'm not particularly like no, I don't have like a. I know that it's like a weird thing, but like there's some black dudes who have like a really like white women. I never understood.
Mhm.
Um, my mom, she, I guess maybe she thought this about me, but she was like telling me right before I went off to college, she was saying that, hey, Nickolas, don't go out and be with a white girl. And I'm not really particularly interested in that, but my mom was my mom was like, oh, but I was like, well, mom, why? Why can't I be with whoever I want to be? She's like, because a white woman will take our money, take our generational wealth that we can contribute and give it to her mixed children who will go be with more white people, and it's kind of taking things away from it. And when my mom says something like that, I see it as a very from coming from a very hurt, what I'm saying, like
It's
standpoint.
that's
You see how that's
racist.
like, huh?
Well, that's racist. That's
Oh,
your
wait, wait,
mom's
wait, wait.
racist.
Oh, of course she is.
It
But
coming
what I'm
from
saying
her
is that,
doesn't change that. That's literally like so this is the
well,
issue, right? Well, wait.
yeah,
Again,
okay,
it
okay,
doesn't need to be like a
okay,
personal interplay or anything. It's just like
yeah,
that is racism. I don't
uh,
subscribe to the school of thought where like it's okay to be prejudiced and do all the racist things if you're the oppressed group. Because I think a lot of these things are cyclical, and I think a lot of
uh,
the underlying components of racism can only really be broken when everyone adopts a more liberal mindset. It's not just about economic parity. You need to have everyone on board with this sort of liberal, race neutral set of values, and attitudes like that are directly antithetical to that, right?
yeah. But it's like, when you kind of guess put it into context, with it's like, I don't know. It seems like more understandable to me that somebody is worried about something like that rather than somebody saying, like, Mexican people, for example, have this thing like Viva la Raza, where they say, we have to preserve the color of our race, and the more white you are, the more, uh, you know, human you are, basically, and we have to make sure that we're keeping ourselves white. It's different from kind of like the fear of saying, I don't want, what I'm saying, all of the things that we worked hard to get to be seeded away. And
They're not
it is
wait,
racist. It is harmful.
they're not seated away just because they go to children whose skin are lighter than you.
Yeah, yeah. No, I'm not, well, I'm sorry. What's the definition of seeded?
Well, they don't. I mean, the same.
I might have misspoke. I didn't mean to
Well,
say
no,
like, if it means like stolen, I'm not
no,
saying that. I'm
just the
just
same
saying that.
amount of money is still going to your children. If you have half
Yeah,
black or half white children, they're still your
yeah,
children. They go to your
yeah.
children. I mean, like you can explain racism as economic anxiety, but I'll still say it's racist when like white workers in the South are afraid of like Mexicans stealing their jobs or whatever. Like even if it comes
Oh,
from legitimate economic anxiety, um, I don't think like yeah. I guess at the end of the day, the issue that I have is it, I don't think there's much like practical utility to distinguishing between these kinds of racisms outside of one being systemic and one being not. I don't think there's any systemic racism that's anti-white, or at least if there is, it's marginal. And there is certainly a lot of anti-black systemic racism, but I feel like I feel like any opposition done here should be an opposition to racism broadly, because otherwise you're fighting a very weird, very arbitrary, very self-defeating kind of battle where you have to simultaneously advocate for like this progressive race neutral we're all equal attitude, and then like next to you are black people trashing white people and saying you shouldn't have your kids marry white people, and we have to be like, well, okay, that's different because they're black, like
oh, we
like
should definitely disagree. We should disagree. We should disagree with that like wholeheartedly. And I do disagree with my mom. You know what I'm saying on that. I'm saying that like there has to be kind of, in my opinion, I think there has to be a difference between how we react to this. Like even among like trailer, people who live in like trailer parks and stuff like that. Their racism is going to be, to me, a little bit more receptive and understandable. The QAnon shit and all that is going to be more acceptable and understandable than a white suburban person being like racist for like no reason at all, or like it just kind of like some weird pseudoscience shit. You know, like the economic anxiety that the white worker kind of feels from like Mexican immigration is something that I can be more sympathetic to, even if I have to disagree with it. I can understand and see the where that's coming from at least, and kind of address it. But I think that there's a big difference between that, let's say, a white person who is very rich, you know what I'm saying, and it just hates black people for some weird reasons.
yeah,
You know what
sure,
I'm saying?
in terms of the harm done, yeah, but you know
Still both racist though,
well,
of
right.
course.
Well, in terms of like oppositional efforts, I feel like it's important to sort of categorically reject them on both hands. The only point I want to get at here is that I feel like you can do so without invoking a kind of weird paternalistic white chauvinism. If anything, I feel like the least paternalistic road that you can go as a white person is this road, because it does come off as kind of paternalistic to go like, oh, well, that's black people's racism, and like it doesn't harm anyone, so like whatever. Like there's a kind of
No,
inherent
no, yeah, no, 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 no,
disempowerment
no.
to that that
Yeah,
feels weird to me. And I think it can harm people too, in large part because
it
historically
does.
anti-white black people have been used as weapons by white supremacists in order to further drive schisms in racial equality movements. So you had Marcus Garvey working at the Ku Klux Klan back at the turn of the century, and you had
Um,
like a Nation of Islam types who were essentially like sabotaging racial
yeah.
equality for a time in the 60s up until now.
Um,
Luis Farrakhan is simultaneously an advocate for conservative policy and also a beacon of, black intolerance conservatives can point at to justify hateful policies they put forward. It's a bad front. So I think it's okay to push back against that. And I think that No Name shit was kind of bordering that. So, I mean, she'll survive me
yeah,
complaining
it's
about
just
her.
like
But
like I said, yeah, for sure. I'm just saying like it's how we disagree about it. That's all I'm saying. Is like especially because it's something that you're going to have to contend with if you're going to go into these neighborhoods and organize, which you agree is essential, right?
well, yeah, you gotta do work.
Yeah, like you have to go to the ghetto and you're gonna come across a lot of fucking racist black people, like no doubt. Like I'm sorry, black people are racist as shit, and it's very annoying. Homophobic, racist, all the things you say. You know what I'm saying? Like they are conservatives in a lot of ways, and you have to be very against that stuff, but you also have to not be so against it to where you say fuck the ghetto. I'm never going there again. I'm not gonna deal with these people. You know what I'm saying? And just kind of like throw them away. And I feel like that's the same thing that kind of goes on with like poor white people as well, poor anybody. It's just I think that a lot of that stuff comes from like a lot of misplaced hurt and misinformation that is being doled out to some people who just been down on their luck. So it's just like one of those things. But I don't think that like of course no you shouldn't just say oh well if a black person has that opinion that's okay. 'Cause
Okay. Then I don't
yeah,
think
that's stupid.
No, I get that. Yeah. Okay,
Yeah,
then I don't think we disagree that much. Yeah, I wasn't looking for blood or anything. It's just this is always a thin line to walk. I feel like a lot of white people in the online left have become really bad advocates for a lot of black or like racial issues because they're
yeah,
so hands off that they either don't speak in it at all, or when they do speak on it, they do so in this chiding, very easy to attack from a conservative perspective, not my lane, not my talk kind of attitude, which is
yeah.
really bad. Is not only really bad at, as is incapable of convincing anyone new, and doesn't really do
Yeah.
much other than like allow the white people watching to like pat themselves on the back for being the bestest allies who would never ever 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 interrupt a black person during an imaginary like social justice meeting that they don't have because they don't leave the house.
And one thing I would like to give to any of those people who might be watching, what I'm saying, who feel they can't speak on these issues. Black racism that emanates from the black community, or at least reverberates there, is harmful to black people as well. Obviously, like it's not just like that. It's you could make the argument that like yeah, it gives a lot of harm. It doesn't give that much harm systemically, but like I think it does. Like for me, at least when I was growing up, there was a big thing when I was in elementary school. I'm autistic, and I was in talented and gifted. I was in a lot of shit, and people would always call me white and call me gay and like all this other type of stuff that kind of is black people trying to draw that line of distinction between themselves and white people, and that's very harmful. You know what I'm saying? To somebody's ability to want to learn and do things.
Yeah, yeah,
So
that's true. And yeah,
yeah,
and the anti-white stuff tends to come out in like colorism as well, where like
yeah, yeah,
dark or medium tone black people will give like shit to white like light tone people or whatever, and you get
yeah,
there's a lot of really weird like mixed race eugenics shit that goes in there too, where there will be like
yeah,
advocates for
yeah,
black
yeah.
people. Yeah, yeah, and they'll be like, yeah, dude, we super care about black people, and they're like, well, what about mixed race people? And they'll be like, fuck
Fuck.
those guys. Yeah, yeah. That's
Yeah.
not good.
Yeah, it's nice when you like playing the dozens and everybody's cool, you know, your cousins or whatever. But it's not. Yeah, you shouldn't. Yeah, there was this girl. Oh my God, there was this girl when I was in high school. She was like from Canada or some shit, but she was like really really dark skinned. And I remember she said something horrible to this light skinned black girl in my grade, and she was saying that like, oh, your grandparents were raped. You know what I'm saying? And they should. You know what I'm saying? You're not a part of this community. She was also happened to be surprise, surprise, a big homophobe. You know what I'm saying? So like
Ah.
that stuff really, goes hand in hand. You have to be very careful about that. But going back to the point that I'm trying to make, if you're going into a black community, I'm not saying that you shouldn't be there, but I would say that, give some love to the white poor communities too, because I know one white leftist organization that deals with like rural area. That's it. I know like 10 that deal with like the black ghettos and stuff. So what I would say is just like when you're going into these different places, you know what I'm saying? You have to practice courtesy, politeness, patience, and don't be super antagonistic, bait bro,
Oh
points
yeah,
are
of course.
bad,
If
you
you're
don't have the
yeah,
stats.
yeah, if you're doing any kind of
Yeah.
advocacy work or anything like that, then you don't have any room to engage in that behavior at all whatsoever. It's very goal oriented. Leave aside the ego, everything else. But I'll talk about that in the in the months that lead up to the efforts. I think we have a lot to look forward to. See if I actually
Yeah.
visit Texas.
Well,
Anyway,
I feel, yeah, I was
uh,
gonna say, I feel a lot more assured and comfortable with you, and I think that this is a good conversation. So thank you for having it with me,
the pleasure was mine. Thank you for coming on.
for sure. All right, well, bye, chat. See y'all later.
They say bye to you too. Take care.
Okay, bye bye.
Oh, that's nice. We had a good conversation. always always a bit of a coin flip with those, isn't it? That was nice. Ended better than began. The issue is like these topics are always going to be really really tricky because it's like there's kind of like an Ouroboros of topics that you can address with things like this because anti-black sentiment is way more harmful than anti-white sentiment in America and basically everywhere else, like massively so, like massively so, you know. um and you have to acknowledge that. I just think that it's generally easier to oppose racism like as a front rather than be like, well, we have to focus most on the systemic part, but like the other parts aren't as bad or whatever, because there are instances where the not as bad racism can be a lot worse than you think it can, like how a lot of anti-white sentiment in the black community comes out as hatred towards mixed race people, or how anti-male sentiment in the feminist community turned into TERFs and they became anti-trans women, because that's what happens when you're essentialist. Essentialism is bad, always. Um, the only thing we should be essentialist about is me, in that I'm essentially a good live stream. Um, uh you get me. But yeah, so I think it's more important to, you have to oppose it on a front, I think. um yeah. Yeah, I just think that works better. But it's always the back and forth. Like, well, don't you think you're over fixating on black racism? It's like, no. The issue is like oftentimes, hey Shu, oftentimes what comes off as more prominent or more present on my streams is going to come down to who like emails me, right? Like if I get 5 emails from kind of like anti-white black people and then I have them on and we do that whole arc, like I am massively overrepresenting the issue, right? Like if I was to fairly represent this issue relative like to like social harm, it would be like 99 white supremacists and then one black supremacist. Maybe even that might be slanted on white supremacy does almost incalculably more damage. So I feel like but you know, I get the convos that I get and I'm happy to talk about what I talk about. So yeah, I don't know. It's just chat. Please always keep in mind that regardless of what we talk about here, like the problems we talk about here are not reflective of like the general problems people experience, okay? Like tankies are not the big problem America is facing, okay? Now I don't think it's all online bullshit. I just think it's skewed. There's a balance there. It's not that it's not real. It exists. It's just it's always going to be filtered through the types of content that I enjoy talking about, especially since you have to keep in mind novelty is a factor, because I would get bored doing nothing but talking about the most important issues, which would probably be like climate change. Like, if all the things I talked about were proportioned perfectly to how harmful they were, it would mostly be like climate change. But I'm not like a scientist, so it would just maybe reading articles on it would be kind of boring and repetitive. And I'm happy to touch on more diverse topics here, because my goal is to give you arguments to help you deal with any bad things you come across. Yeah, exactly, Shu. Shu says, this was the problem I had when I covered SJWs. People started to assume they're like the biggest issue, and they're not. They're just annoying and fun to cover. That's why I always advocate you have to make videos on or do content for affirmative, positive things that you want rather than just the things that you oppose. Because if I made videos exclusively on the things that I dislike, you guys would probably think, based on the videos I produce, that the main problem facing America is anime culture and Final Fantasy 14, fans. Uh, which would give you a somewhat biased perspective on, the politics at hand. You have to make affirmative cases. And this was the issue with the whole skeptic community as well, because they pretended to be like, oh yeah, we're classical liberals. We're classical liberals. We're feminists, egalitarians, actually. It's like being a super feminist, right? Right, but like all they did was videos on how blue hairs are destroying America, and then like 5 years later, now Sargon, the Jewish question of Akkad, is like basically a neo-Nazi, and the rest of them are either Nazis or somewhere in between being a reactionary and a Nazi, except for a few of them. I think Thunderfoot got out of the movement. Shion Head is of course a communist. Some people got out, but yeah. You will generally notice that the worst political content creators are the ones that only ever argue against people they hate. Jimmy Dore is a great example. Go watch Jimmy Dore's live streams or watch his videos. 99.9% attacking the people he doesn't like. And oh, he's left leaning in spite of the fact that he only attacks left leaning people. Sargon was the same way. Destiny these days, I think, does this more than he used to. I think it's a sign of political decay. That you're energized mostly by hatred towards groups you don't like, rather than a conviction in the things that you do like, which is of course what everyone should have ideally. Um, exactly, Shu. Well, on the plus side, Shu, you throwing them for a loop with that definitely made a lot of people angry in a very funny way with the Bernie support. So, you know, that was good.